What if you discovered you had a lost daughter living on the streets, not knowing you exist? That's exactly what happens in today's story, and the twist will leave you speechless. A cold-hearted billionaire must choose between his luxury life or taking responsibility for a little girl who might be his own daughter. And the ending? Absolutely mind-blowing. So, leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this heartfelt story. The morning air in New York City was sharp and unforgiving, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Pedestrians bustled along the crowded sidewalks, their faces buried in scarves and collars, their breath forming tiny clouds as they rushed past street vendors, honking cabs, and flashing billboards. On the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, near a busy cafe with warm lights and the rich aroma of fresh coffee spilling onto the street, a 6-year-old girl sat curled up on a cold slab of concrete. She was bundled in an old, oversized hoodie, its fabric worn thin and full of holes, barely enough to shield her from the freezing wind. Wrapped in her small arms was a tiny golden-furred puppy, shivering just as much as she was. The girl's name was Lily. Her big blue eyes, filled with both curiosity and exhaustion, scanned the crowd moving past her, searching for kindness in a sea of indifference. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her long, unwashed blonde hair clung to her pale skin. She held her puppy, Buddy, closer to her chest, whispering softly to him. "It's okay, Buddy," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the city noise. "We'll be warm soon, I promise." The little dog let out a soft whimper, curling up tighter in her arms. People walked by without stopping, their eyes darting away uncomfortably, as if acknowledging her presence would make them responsible for her. Some clutched their purses tighter, others simply ignored her completely. A few glanced at her sympathetically but kept moving, too busy, too cold, or too hesitant to get involved. Lily was used to it. She had been living on the streets for over a year now, ever since her mother, Rachel, had disappeared. First, they had lived in cheap motels, then in shelters, until eventually, there was nowhere else to go. She had learned how to survive, how to stay invisible, and most of all, how to trust no one. But no matter how tough she tried to be, she wasn't alone. Buddy had been her only friend, her only family. She had found him abandoned in an alleyway, just a tiny ball of fur, hungry and alone, just like her. They had saved each other that night. Since then, she had taken care of him the best she could, even giving him a portion of whatever food she managed to get. That morning, however, she hadn't eaten anything yet. Her stomach ached with hunger, but the cold was worse. Her fingers were stiff, her toes numb inside her torn sneakers. If she didn't find a place to warm up soon, she knew she wouldn't last much longer. As she pulled her hoodie tighter around herself, she watched the door of the cafe swing open and closed, letting out bursts of warmth each time. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries made her mouth water. Her fingers tightened around Buddy. She wished someone, anyone, would notice her. Just as she was about to give up and move to another street, something unexpected happened. A tall man in a dark tailored suit and expensive leather shoes stepped out of a sleek black town car, his phone pressed to his ear. He was Ethan Carter, a billionaire real estate mogul, known for his cold and ruthless business tactics. Ethan was the type of man who never stopped moving. His world revolved around deals, contracts, and acquisitions. Emotions were an inconvenience, and personal attachments were liabilities. As he strode toward the cafe, he barely noticed the people around him, until his gaze locked onto Lily. Something made him stop. For a brief moment, he forgot about the phone call, forgot about his schedule, forgot about everything else. There was something about the way the little girl sat there, holding her tiny dog as if he were the only thing keeping her alive. Something about her big, haunting blue eyes, eyes that felt strangely familiar. A sudden wave of unease washed over him. His grip on his phone tightened. "Sir, are you still there?" His assistant's voice came through the line. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his dark brown hair, shaking off whatever strange feeling had just crept up on him. He was not the type of man to get distracted. He turned away from the girl and headed into the cafe. Lily watched him go, her tiny hands tightening around Buddy. Just another person who didn't care. Her stomach rumbled, and she buried her face into Buddy's fur, trying to ignore the hunger, the cold, and the overwhelming loneliness. Inside the cafe, Ethan ordered his usual coffee and croissant, but something about the girl outside lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, he couldn't shake a feeling, a strange, unsettling sense that he had just walked away from something important, something that, deep down, he wasn't ready to face. Inside the cafe, the warm air and scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around Ethan Carter, but for the first time in years, he felt unsettled. As he moved toward the counter, his mind kept drifting back to the little girl outside. He had seen countless homeless people in New York. He had learned to tune them out, just like everyone else. But this time was different. Her blue eyes, wide and cautious, had stuck with him. The way she clutched that tiny dog, the way her body trembled from the cold, it made something deep in his chest tighten. He shook it off. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions interfere with his day. Black coffee. No sugar, he ordered. His voice clipped, professional. "And your usual croissant, Mr. Carter?" the barista asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." While he waited, he turned toward the large window facing the street. Outside, the girl had curled further into herself, pulling her hoodie over her head as people rushed past her without a second glance. Something about it pissed him off. The barista handed him his order, and without thinking, he grabbed an extra hot chocolate and a second croissant before heading for the door. Lily didn't notice him at first. She was busy rubbing Buddy's tiny paws between her hands, trying to warm him up. "Hey," Ethan said, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the street. She stiffened instantly, her fingers tightening around Buddy. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he added quickly, crouching down to her level. "Here." She eyed him warily, then looked at what he was holding. A steaming cup of hot chocolate and a flaky croissant, golden and fresh from the oven. Her stomach twisted in hunger. Lily had learned not to take food from strangers too quickly. Sometimes there were conditions. Sometimes it came with expectations. She had seen it happen to other kids, had almost fallen for it herself once. So, she kept her voice careful. "What do you want?" Ethan wasn't sure how to answer that. Nothing about this made sense. He had a million things to do today, a schedule packed with back-to-back meetings, and yet here he was, crouching on a dirty sidewalk, handing food to a little girl he didn't know. And for the life of him, he couldn't understand why. "I just thought you looked cold," he said finally, placing the cup and croissant on the sidewalk beside her. "And hungry." Lily hesitated, but Buddy, smelling the food, let out a soft whimper, and her resolve cracked just a little. She reached out slowly, her fingers numb as she wrapped them around the warm cup. The heat burned in the best way possible, chasing away the numbness in her hands. She took a small sip. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, rich and creamy, warmer than anything she had tasted in a long time. She let out a small sigh before she could stop herself. Ethan saw it. He wasn't sure why that small sound made something tighten in his chest again, but it did. She picked up the croissant next, breaking off a small piece and giving it to Buddy first. That hit him harder than it should have. She was starving. That much was obvious. But instead of stuffing the food in her own mouth, she fed the dog first. Ethan swallowed hard, pushing away an unexpected lump in his throat. Lily chewed her own piece slowly, her sharp eyes never leaving him. She had spent enough time on the streets to know that people didn't just do things out of kindness. There was always a reason. "Why are you really giving me this?" she asked. Ethan hesitated again. He could have told her the truth, that he didn't know why, that something about her felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Instead, he shrugged. "I had extra," he lied. Lily didn't believe him, but she was too hungry to care. She finished the croissant in small bites, never taking her eyes off him. Ethan glanced at his watch. He was already late for his meeting, but for some reason, he didn't stand up and leave. Instead, he asked, "Where are your parents?" Lily's expression changed instantly. She stiffened, her guard going up like a shield. "Gone," she said flatly. Ethan studied her. Something about the way she said it, the way she refused to look at him, felt off. He was good at reading people. It was part of what made him a billionaire businessman. He knew when someone was lying, afraid, or hiding something. And right now, this little girl was all three. He leaned forward slightly. Gone where? Lily stared at the sidewalk, running her fingers over Buddy's soft fur. My mom's name was Rachel, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. She went away and never came back. Rachel. The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. A flicker of something dark passed through his features. Years ago, before he built his empire, before he became the man he was now, he had known a woman named Rachel. A woman he had once loved. A woman he had lost. His heart pounded, a sense of dread creeping in. What was her last name? He asked carefully. Lily hesitated, then looked up at him. She swallowed hard before whispering, Carter. The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. His last name. His pulse roared in his ears as the reality crashed over him. This wasn't just some random homeless girl on the street. This child might be his daughter. Ethan Carter felt his world shift. The sounds of New York faded, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He stared at the girl in front of him, at her messy blonde hair, her sharp blue eyes, the same shade as his own. He tried to breathe, to process what she had just said. Rachel Carter. It had been more than 6 years since he had last spoken to Rachel, and now, here was this little girl, sitting on a frozen sidewalk, homeless, alone, and possibly his daughter. Ethan's chest tightened. Your mother, he said carefully, his voice lower now. Rachel Carter. What happened to her? Lily looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the frayed sleeve of her hoodie. She went away, she said again, quieter this time. Ethan clenched his jaw. Something was wrong. He could see it in the way she hugged her dog tighter, in the way her gaze darted around as if she was waiting for something bad to happen. His mind was racing. He needed to know more. Where did she go? Lily swallowed hard. I don't know, she whispered. She never came back. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to control the emotions crashing through him. He had built his empire on logic, control, and ruthless decision-making. He didn't let emotions interfere with his judgment. But right now, that control was slipping through his fingers. Rachel had been his world once. They had met when he was just starting out, before the billions, before the power. She had been the only woman who ever saw him as more than just a man chasing money. And then, one day, she disappeared. She had left without a word. No calls, no messages, nothing. He had spent months trying to find her, but she had vanished. Eventually, he forced himself to move on, burying himself in work, convincing himself that she had made her choice. Now, staring at this little girl who looked so much like her, he felt like the past was slamming into him all over again. His hands curled into fists. What happened after she left? Lily shrugged, but he could tell it was forced. I lived with some people for a while, she mumbled. But then I left. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had seen children like her before. Kids who had been through too much, who had learned to trust no one. You were in foster care? Lily's jaw tensed, and for the first time, her expression turned guarded. I don't want to talk about it. That answer made something sharp twist in Ethan's chest. He had always been good at reading between the lines. The way her voice tightened, the way she avoided his gaze, it told him enough. She had been through hell, and now, she was out here, in the freezing cold, surviving on her own. Ethan felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the situation. How had this happened? How had no one noticed? Why the hell had no one helped her? His jaw tightened. Lily, do you have anywhere to go? She hesitated. It was only for a second, but he caught it. She was trying to think of a lie. Finally, she shook her head. I'm fine. Bullshit. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. What the hell was he supposed to do now? This wasn't part of his day. He had meetings, deals to close, investors to impress. He was supposed to be in a boardroom right now, not crouched on a sidewalk, talking to a homeless 6-year-old. But none of that mattered. Not now. Not when he was almost certain that this girl was his. He looked at her again, really looked at her. The sharpness of her blue eyes. The way her mouth curved when she frowned. The stubbornness in the way she sat, legs pulled tight to her chest. She was his. He knew it, and that changed everything. "You can't stay out here," he said finally, his voice firm. Lily's head snapped up, her body going rigid. "I don't need your help," she said quickly, clutching Buddy tighter. Ethan stared at her, then at the way her hands were trembling despite the warmth of the hot chocolate he had given her. He let out a slow breath, trying to choose his next words carefully. "Look, I know you don't trust me," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But it's freezing and you're not safe out here." Lily didn't respond, but she also didn't run. That was something. Ethan glanced around, his mind racing. He needed to get her somewhere warm, somewhere safe, and he needed to do it now. "Come with me," he said finally. "I'll get you food, a warm place to stay. You don't have to stay if you don't want to, but just for today, let me help you." Lily's gaze flickered with hesitation. She wanted to say no. He could tell, but she was tired, freezing, hungry, and Buddy was shivering in her arms. She bit her lip, then finally gave the smallest nod. Ethan let out the breath he didn't realize he was holding. "All right," he said, standing up. "Come on." Lily stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting too long in the cold. She hesitated only for a moment before following him toward the waiting black town car. As they walked, Ethan glanced down at her, his mind still spinning. He wasn't sure what the hell he was doing, but one thing was clear. He wasn't walking away from her. Not now. Not ever. The ride through Manhattan was silent, except for the muffled hum of traffic and the occasional distant honk of a car horn. Lily sat stiffly in the back seat of the sleek, black town car, her small hands gripping Buddy tightly as if someone might try to take him away. She didn't look at Ethan. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching as skyscrapers and neon billboards blurred past. She had been in cars before, but never like this. Never one so clean, so quiet, so expensive. Ethan, sitting beside her, watched her carefully. She was too still, her shoulders tense, her jaw locked tight. She wasn't just wary, she was afraid. He had seen that look before. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in people who had been backed into a corner too many times. He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the leather seat, trying to make sense of the situation. Was she really his daughter? She had to be. The timing fit. The resemblance was undeniable. But still, he needed to be sure. He needed answers. "Do you remember where you lived before?" he asked finally, keeping his tone casual. Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around Buddy's fur. "A little," she mumbled. "It was a small place. With my mom. Before she left." Ethan's chest tightened. "Left where?" Lily shrugged, but the movement was rigid. She was hiding something. Ethan watched her closely. "Lily," he said, softer this time. "What really happened?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she whispered, "She got sick." Ethan froze. His fingers curled into fists, his pulse quickening. "Rachel. Sick." He swallowed hard. "What kind of sick?" Lily's voice was so quiet he barely heard her. "Cancer." The air left Ethan's lungs all at once. He turned away, staring blankly out the window, his mind reeling. Rachel had been dying, and he never knew. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from his chest. He had spent years thinking she had left because she didn't want him, that she had moved on. But the truth was so much worse. She had been fighting for her life, and he hadn't been there. He had failed her. And worse, he had failed Lily. His jaw clenched as he forced himself to stay calm. "And after she passed away?" he asked, his voice tight. "What happened to you?" Lily's eyes darkened. "I want to live with a lady," she said. "She said she was my foster mom, but she didn't like me very much." Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. "What do you mean?" Lily shrugged again, but this time, her eyes didn't meet his. "She said I was too much trouble, that I cried too much about my mom. She didn't like Buddy either. She wanted me to get rid of him, but I wouldn't. So one day, she said I had to leave." Ethan's fingers tightened against his knee. She had been thrown away, like trash. He tried to breathe, to push down the rage boiling inside him. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked, barely managing to keep his voice steady. Lily hesitated before answering. "A year," she whispered. A year. Ethan felt sick. This tiny girl had been surviving alone on the streets for a year, while he had been sitting in his penthouse, dealing with business deals and billion-dollar acquisitions, completely unaware that his own child was out there, cold and hungry. He clenched his jaw, his vision blurring for a moment as a deep, suffocating guilt settled over him. He had to fix this. That woman, he said. Your foster mom. Do you remember her name? Lily shook her head. Just Miss Patty. Ethan filed the name away, his mind already racing with possibilities. Someone had failed Lily, and he was going to find out who. You shouldn't have been left out there, he said, his voice coming out harder than he intended. That shouldn't have happened to you. Lily blinked at him, her expression unreadable. Yeah, well, she muttered. It did. Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his seat. You don't have to do this alone anymore, he said. Lily's brows furrowed, her small hands still gripping Buddy like a lifeline. Why do you care? She asked bluntly. Ethan's throat tightened. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Because you might be mine. Because I should have been there. Because I won't let you suffer another damn day. But he couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, he said, because no kid should have to survive on their own. Lily studied him for a long time, her blue eyes piercing. Finally, she turned back to the window, curling up closer to Buddy. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye, his jaw still tight. He had come across a lot of mysteries in his life, but this was the most important one yet, and he was going to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. The ride to Ethan's penthouse in Manhattan felt like it stretched for hours, though in reality, it was only about 20 minutes. Lily remained silent, curled up against the door, her tiny hands gripping Buddy as though afraid someone would rip him away from her. Ethan tried to focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts were a storm. He had spent years believing Rachel had walked away from him, but the truth was, she had been dying alone, leaving behind a daughter neither of them had known existed. And now that daughter was sitting right next to him, broken, hungry, and deeply mistrustful of the world. His gut twisted. If Lily really was his child, then he had failed her in ways he couldn't even begin to count, and he had no idea how to fix it. The arrival at the penthouse, the car pulled up to the glass high-rise on the Upper East Side, and Ethan stepped out first, turning back to Lily. She hesitated. The sheer luxury of the building made her feel even smaller. The entrance was lined with black marble, doormen in crisp suits stood at attention, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood. This was not her world. She tightened her grip on Buddy, pressing her lips together. Come on, Ethan said, his voice unreadable. You'll be warm inside. Lily didn't move right away. She had been inside a lot of places she wasn't welcome before, and she knew how those stories usually ended. People said they wanted to help. They gave you food, sometimes let you stay for a night. But eventually, they wanted something in return, or they just got tired of you. She wasn't about to let herself get too comfortable here. But Buddy was shivering, and her fingers were already going numb from the cold. So, finally, she took a deep breath and followed Ethan inside. A world of luxury. The elevator ride was too quiet. Lily stared at the polished floors, her reflection staring back at her from the gold-trimmed walls. Ethan watched her carefully, noting the way she stood stiffly, as if she was waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into a whole new world. The penthouse was nothing like anything she had ever seen. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a breathtaking view of the New York skyline, the city lights twinkling like stars. The floors were a cool, expensive white marble, and the furniture looked like something out of a magazine. Sleek, modern, and untouched. A large fireplace crackled in the living room, casting a soft glow over the space. Lily hesitated at the entrance, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie. This wasn't just a nice apartment. It was the kind of place people like her never even dreamed about stepping into. Buddy whined softly, sniffing the air, his tiny tail twitching with curiosity. Ethan noticed Lily's hesitation. You don't have to be afraid, he said quietly. She stiffened. I'm not afraid, she shot back. He almost smiled. Almost. She had fire in her. That much was clear. Come on, he said, nodding toward the couch. "Sit down. Get warm." Lily didn't move at first. Then, cautiously, she walked to the plush leather couch, sitting down on the very edge, her body tense. Buddy immediately curled up beside her, his tiny body pressing into her lap. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, taking a moment to collect himself before walking to the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a bowl of soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. Lily eyed it warily. "You poisoned it?" she asked bluntly. Ethan snorted, caught off guard. "If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't have brought you to my penthouse first." Lily shrugged. "You never know." Ethan let out a slow breath. This kid had been through too much. He set the food in front of her. "Just eat." Lily hesitated, but the second the smell hit her, her stomach clenched painfully. She picked up the sandwich, biting into it, and for the first time in a long time, she tasted something real, something warm, something safe. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body screamed at her to devour every bite. Ethan sat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't say anything. He just watched. And the more he looked at her, the more certain he became. She was his. He just needed proof. The DNA test. Ethan wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He built his empire by analyzing every risk, every move, every possibility. So, even though he knew deep down that Lily was his daughter, he needed confirmation. "Lily," he said after a few moments. She looked up, her cheeks slightly fuller from the food, but her guard still firmly in place. "I need to ask you something," Ethan continued, "but I need you to be honest with me." Lily said nothing, just stared at him. He leaned forward. "I need to run a test," he said carefully, "to see if we're related." Lily froze. Her fingers tightened around Buddy. "You think I'm lying?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan shook his head. "No, but if I can prove it, if I can prove you're mine, it'll help me keep you safe. Legally." Lily stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. "Fine," she muttered. "Do whatever you want." Ethan took a deep breath. He hadn't expected her to agree so easily, but as he looked at her, something in his chest ached. This little girl had spent her entire life being tossed aside, being unwanted, being ignored. And now, she didn't even seem to care if she had a father or not. Ethan clenched his jaw, his voice low. "If the test says you're mine," he said, "I'm not going anywhere, Lily." She looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "People always say that," she murmured. "And then they leave." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Not this time," he said. And for the first time, Lily didn't argue. The penthouse was silent except for the occasional click of ice against glass as Ethan poured himself a drink. He rarely drank at home. His life was too structured, too controlled for indulgences like this. But tonight, after everything he had learned, his hands were unsteady. Rachel had been dying, and he never knew. Lily had been thrown away, and no one cared. Now, she was in his home, curled up on the couch with Buddy asleep on her lap, looking small and out of place. Ethan watched her from across the room, the weight of reality pressing down on him. What the hell was he supposed to do now? He knew the right thing, to take care of her, to make sure she never had to sleep on the streets again. But Ethan Carter had never been a father before. He had spent his entire life building an empire, making ruthless decisions, cutting people out when necessary. He didn't know how to raise a child, much less one who had been through what Lily had. And what if she wasn't his? What if the DNA test came back and proved she had no connection to him? Would he be able to walk away then? He rubbed his temple, exhaling sharply. No, he already knew the answer. Even if she wasn't his, he wouldn't let her go back to the streets. Not after everything he had seen. Not after everything she had told him. Lily had already lost too much, and Ethan wasn't going to let her lose anything else. The morning after Lily woke up with a start, her body instinctively tensed for danger. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The room was too quiet, too clean. Then she saw Buddy curled up beside her, his tiny chest rising and falling, and the memories rushed back. The fancy penthouse, the man who gave her food. Ethan. She sat up slowly, her bones aching from months of sleeping on the ground. The warm blanket someone had draped over her slipped onto the floor. She glanced around, her heart pounding slightly. She had slept too deeply. That was dangerous. When you lived on the streets, you didn't let yourself sleep too hard. You stayed light, ready to run if you had to. She turned her head and saw Ethan sitting at the massive dining table, already dressed in his usual sharp suit, flipping through a stack of papers. "Morning," he said without looking up. Lily rubbed her eyes. "Is it still snowing?" Ethan glanced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city was wrapped in white. "Yeah," he said. "It's worse than yesterday." Lily swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. If she had still been outside, she and Buddy probably wouldn't have survived the night. Ethan stood up, setting his papers aside. "Come eat," he said simply. Lily hesitated, but then slowly slid off the couch, Buddy following closely at her heels. When she reached the table, she saw a plate of pancakes, bacon, and fresh fruit waiting for her. She blinked at it. "You made this?" she asked suspiciously. Ethan scoffed. "No, my housekeeper dropped it off earlier." Lily picked up a piece of bacon, biting into it carefully. The moment it hit her tongue, her eyes closed. Warm, salty, real. She forced herself to eat slowly, though every part of her wanted to shove the food into her mouth before someone could take it away. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching her. "After breakfast," he said, "we're going to the doctor." Lily froze mid-bite. "Why?" she asked warily. "For the test," Ethan said. "The DNA test." Lily set her fork down. "And if it says you're not my dad?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan held her gaze. "You'll still stay here," he said. "If you want to." Lily stared at him, trying to read him. Most people weren't honest with her. Most people promise things and then change their minds. "Why would you do that?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Because no one should have left you out there," he said. "And because I don't turn my back on people I care about." Lily swallowed hard. No one had ever said that to her before. Not in a way that felt real. The DNA test at the doctor's office was bright and sterile. The walls painted a shade of off-white that made everything feel too clean. Lily sat on the examination table, kicking her legs nervously, while Buddy sat in Ethan's lap. Something the billionaire had never expected to happen. The test itself was simple, a quick swab of the inside of her cheek, then another for Ethan. "Results will take a few days," the doctor said, setting the samples aside. Lily nodded quietly, but Ethan could see the way she kept wringing her hands, her nerves barely contained. As they left the office, she spoke suddenly. "If it says you're my dad," she asked, "then what happens?" Ethan hesitated. "I guess that depends on you," he said honestly. Lily frowned. "You mean I'd get to choose?" "Of course," Ethan said, glancing down at her. "This isn't about what I want, Lily. It's about what's best for you." Lily let out a sharp laugh. "That's new," she muttered. Ethan clenched his jaw. Someone had failed this kid. Badly. And whether she was his by blood or not, he wasn't going to let it happen again. The waiting game back at the penthouse, Lily kept her distance, but Ethan could tell she was watching him more closely, testing him, waiting to see if he would change his mind. And Ethan? He was realizing something dangerous. It didn't matter what the DNA test said, because he had already made his decision. Lily was his, one way or another, and he wasn't going to let her go. The next few days passed in a strange blur. For Lily, living in Ethan Carter's penthouse felt like stepping into a completely different world, one that didn't quite feel real. Everything was too big, too clean, too expensive. The furniture looked untouched. The floors gleamed like they had never been walked on, and the city view from the massive windows seemed more like a picture than something real. She didn't know how to exist in a place like this, so she did what she always did. She stayed quiet, observant, ready to run if she had to. A life she didn't understand. Ethan noticed everything. How Lily never touched more than half of her food, no matter how much was in front of her. How she flinched whenever a door shut too loudly. How she never let go of Buddy, her tiny dog practically glued to her side at all times. And most of all, how she never got comfortable. She barely spoke, barely let her guard down. And that bothered him more than it should have. You're allowed to sit on the couch, you know, Ethan told her on the third night, watching as she perched stiffly on the edge of the cushion, like she was waiting to be kicked off. Lily shrugged. I don't want to mess it up. Ethan frowned. It's a couch, kid, not a museum piece. She just shrugged again, and that was what made his chest tighten. How she didn't even seem to believe she had the right to take up space. Shopping trip disaster. Ethan wasn't good with kids, but even he knew Lily couldn't just wear the same hoodie and torn sneakers every day. So, 2 days after the DNA test, he took her shopping. It was a bad idea. He realized that the second they walked into the store. Lily stiffened immediately, her fingers digging into Buddy's fur as they stepped inside the massive department store filled with rows of clean, folded clothes. Her eyes darted around like she was expecting someone to kick her out any second. Ethan had never thought about this before, about how something as simple as buying clothes could feel like a battlefield to a kid who had nothing. Pick whatever you want, he told her, keeping his voice even. Lily frowned, shifting uncomfortably. You want me to pick? Yeah, whatever you like. She hesitated, looking at the racks of expensive jackets and neatly folded sweaters like they might bite her. Ethan could almost see the calculations happening in her head. She was used to surviving, to taking only what she needed. And now he was telling her to just choose? Slowly, she reached for a plain gray hoodie, the cheapest thing on the rack. Ethan exhaled. Lily, you don't have to pick the cheapest thing here. Her eyes snapped up to his, sharp and guarded. Why? She asked. Why would you waste money on me? Ethan stilled. Something about the way she said it, like she genuinely couldn't understand, made him feel like he had been punched in the gut. He crouched down, leveling his gaze with hers. Because I can, he said simply. And because you deserve things, Lily. Nice things. Things that fit. Things that keep you warm. She swallowed, looking down at Buddy, avoiding his eyes. People don't just do things like that, she muttered. Maybe not, Ethan said, standing up. But I do. Lily didn't say anything else. But when they left the store, she was clutching a warm winter coat and a new pair of boots. And Ethan counted that as a win. Nightmares and trust that night. Ethan woke up to the sound of whimpering. At first, he thought it was Buddy. But when he got up and walked toward the guest room, he realized the sound was coming from Lily. She was muttering in her sleep, curled into a tight ball, her small hands gripping the blanket like a lifeline. Her face was tense, her brows furrowed, her lips trembling. Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should wake her. Then, suddenly, she gasped awake, her body jerking, eyes wide and panicked. She looked around wildly, disoriented, and then she saw Ethan. Her breathing was ragged, her tiny frame shaking. Ethan frowned. Nightmare? She nodded slowly, still looking at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. I used to get them too, he admitted after a moment. When I was a kid. Lily blinked, caught off guard. You? Ethan leaned against the doorframe, nodding. Yeah. Lily studied him, searching his face for any signs of a lie. Finally, she let out a small breath. Did they go away? She asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. Sometimes, he admitted. Sometimes they don't, but they get easier to deal with. Lily didn't say anything, just stared down at her hands. Ethan wasn't sure what made him say the next words, but he meant them. You're safe here, Lily, he said. Nothing's going to happen to you. She didn't respond, but for the first time, she didn't flinch when he said it. And that was enough for now. The call that changed everything. The next morning, Ethan was in his office when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Carter? A professional voice said. This is Dr. Martinez from the genetics lab. We have the results of your DNA test. Ethan straightened immediately, his heartbeat picking up. And there was a short pause. Then, the test confirms that you are a 99.9% match. Lily is your biological daughter. Ethan's stomach dropped, even though he had already known. Hearing it confirmed out loud still hit him like a freight train. His hands tightened into fists. Thank you, he said, his voice calm, controlled. Send me the official paperwork. Of course, sir. Ethan hung up, staring at his desk. Lily was his daughter. The little girl who had been living on the streets, abandoned, alone, was his flesh and blood. And now, he had to figure out what the hell to do next. Ethan Carter had faced countless high-stakes situations in his life. Hostile takeovers, billion-dollar deals, courtroom battles that could make or break an empire. But nothing had ever felt as heavy as the weight of the DNA test results sitting in front of him. Lily was his daughter. He hadn't just found a lost child. He had found his own flesh and blood, abandoned and alone on the streets. And now, he had to figure out what the hell that meant. Telling Lily was in the living room, sitting on the plush rug with Buddy curled up next to her. She was sketching something in a notebook Ethan had bought her, her fingers gripping the pencil tightly. She still wasn't used to having things of her own. Ethan took a slow breath, then walked over and sat on the couch across from her. "Lily," he said, his voice steady but firm. She looked up, her blue eyes sharp. He hesitated for just a second before saying it. The DNA test came back. Lily's grip on the pencil tightened just slightly. "And?" she asked, her voice flat, unreadable. Ethan exhaled. "You're mine." Lily didn't move. She didn't react at all, really. Just stared at him like she was trying to process the words. Then, slowly, she set her notebook aside. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's up to you," he said honestly. Lily frowned, her brows knitting together. "Up to me?" Ethan nodded. "I don't know what your life has been like, Lily," he said carefully. "I don't know what you've been through. But I do know this. You don't have to be alone anymore. You don't have to run anymore." Lily's jaw tightened. "I don't run," she muttered. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You survive," he corrected. "But you shouldn't have had to." "That's on me." She blinked at him, caught off guard. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I should have been there," he admitted. "For you. For your mom. I didn't even know. But that doesn't change the fact that you needed someone, and I wasn't there." Lily looked away. "She never told you about me?" Ethan shook his head. "No. If she had, things would have been different." Lily was silent for a long time. Finally, she sighed. "So what? You just decide to be my dad now?" Ethan hesitated. "I can't force you to stay here, Lily. But I want you to." Lily studied him carefully, her fingers brushing over Buddy's fur. Finally, she asked, "And if I don't?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll make sure you have somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere good. But I hope you'll stay." Lily looked down at Buddy, stroking his fur absently. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Then let's change that," he said. Lily didn't respond. But for the first time, she didn't say no. The past catches up. Ethan spent the next 2 days trying to give Lily space while also making sure she knew she wasn't alone. He didn't push her, didn't force her to talk. He just showed up. He made sure she had food, warm clothes, a place to exist without fear. And slowly, so slowly, she started to trust that he wouldn't just disappear. But just when Ethan started to think they were making progress, the past came knocking. It started with a phone call. Ethan was in his office when his assistant, Jordan, walked in, looking paler than usual. "You need to see this," he said, sliding a tablet across the desk. Ethan frowned and picked it up. His stomach dropped. A news article. The headline read, "Missing girl found with billionaire Ethan Carter. But is she safe?" Ethan felt a cold fury build in his chest as he skimmed the article. The piece spun the story completely wrong, suggesting that Lily was a runaway, that he had somehow taken her in secrecy, that he might not even have her best interests at heart. And worse, it named her mother, which meant someone from Rachel's past might come looking. Ethan's fingers curled into a fist. "Who leaked this?" he demanded. Jordan shook his head. "No idea. But there's more." He slid another document across the table. A legal notice. Ethan's blood went cold as he saw the name on it. Mark Reynolds, Rachel's ex-boyfriend, the man who had hurt her, the man Ethan hadn't thought about in years, the man who now claimed he had a right to Lily. Ethan stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Get me everything we have on him," he said through gritted teeth. Now. Jordan nodded and rushed out. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. This wasn't just a complication. This was a threat. And if Mark Reynolds thought for even a second that he was going to take Lily away, he was dead wrong. The warning that night, Ethan sat Lily down in the living room, his expression unreadable. "Lily," he said, "there's something you need to know." She immediately tensed, her fingers twitching toward Buddy. Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. "There's a man," he said. "His name is Mark Reynolds. He was involved with your mother before I knew her." Lily's face darkened. "I know who he is," she muttered. Ethan's stomach twisted. That meant Mark had been in her life at some point, and from the way she reacted, it wasn't a good memory. "He's trying to claim he has a right to you," Ethan continued carefully. "That he should get custody." Lily went rigid. Ethan expected fear. Instead, what he got was anger. Her small hands clenched into fists, her jaw tightening. "No," she said fiercely. "No. He doesn't get to do that." Ethan's gaze softened just slightly. "I know," he said, "and I won't let it happen." Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes burning. "Promise me," she whispered. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I swear," he said. "No one is taking you away from me." Lily exhaled shakily, then reached down and picked up Buddy, holding him against her chest. She still didn't say much, but for the first time since she arrived, she looked at Ethan like maybe, just maybe, she believed him. Ethan Carter had spent his entire life winning battles before they even started. But this was different. This wasn't about a hostile takeover or a billion-dollar negotiation. This was about Lily, and making sure no one ever hurt her again. And that meant one thing. Mark Reynolds had to be stopped. Preparing for war, Ethan's penthouse had turned into a war room. His legal team sat around the massive conference table in his home office, documents and files spread out in front of them. Mark Reynolds filed for emergency custody. Jordan, his assistant, explained. "He's claiming he's Lily's legal guardian and that you," he hesitated, glancing at Ethan, "that you coerced her into staying here." Ethan let out a slow, controlled breath. "And the courts are actually entertaining this?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "The judge hasn't ruled on it yet, but Reynolds has a history of playing dirty. He's using the media attention to make it look like you're some billionaire who—" "I get it," Ethan said sharply, cutting him off. He didn't need to hear the rest. They were painting him as a villain, as if Lily hadn't been starving and freezing on the streets before he found her, as if Mark Reynolds had ever given a damn about her before now. His lawyer, James Holloway, cleared his throat. "Legally, you have the upper hand. The DNA test proves your paternity. But we have a problem." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What problem?" James set a file on the table. "Lily doesn't legally exist in the system," he said. "Rachel never put Ethan Carter on the birth certificate. And since she died, no one legally transferred guardianship." Ethan stiffened. "Meaning?" "Meaning the courts could side with Reynolds if he proves he had a previous relationship with Rachel and claims she wanted him to take Lily in after she died." Ethan clenched his jaw. Rachel would have never wanted that. Not after what Mark had done to her. But without proof, it was his word against Mark's. And Ethan didn't like uncertainty. "Find me something," he ordered. "A witness. A record. Anything that proves Rachel wouldn't have wanted him anywhere near Lily." James nodded. "I'm on it." Lily's fear that night. Lily paced the living room, her small hands clenched into fists. She had heard everything. She wasn't stupid. "Is he really going to try and take me?" she asked, her voice sharp. But beneath it, Ethan could hear the fear. Ethan stood in front of her, arms crossed. "He's going to try," he admitted. "But I won't let him win." Lily shook her head violently, her face twisted with anger. "You don't understand," she snapped. "You don't know what he's like." Ethan stilled. "Then tell me," he said carefully. Lily swallowed hard, her arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to hold something in. "He was my mom's boyfriend," she said slowly. "A long time ago. When I was little." Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that already, but hearing Lily say it, hearing the way her voice shook just a little, was different. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Lily shook her head quickly. "Not me," she whispered. But my mom. All the time. Ethan's hands curled into fists. His mind flashed back to Rachel, her laughter, her sharp wit, her fire. And he imagined that same woman hiding bruises from him, too proud to ask for help. And he hadn't even been there to protect her. His jaw tightened. "He will never touch you," Ethan said, his voice deadly serious. "Ever." Lily looked at him then, her big blue eyes filled with something raw. "Promise," she whispered. Ethan knelt in front of her, leveling his gaze with hers. "I swear it," he said. "On my life." Lily stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. And for the first time, Ethan saw it. She believed him. The courtroom showdown the day of the hearing arrived too quickly. Ethan walked into the family court building like he was walking into a battlefield. He wore a sharp black suit, his face unreadable, his posture unshakable. Mark Reynolds was already there, sitting at the opposite table, his greasy smile making Ethan's blood boil. Lily sat next to Ethan, her fingers tightly gripping his sleeve under the table. She was terrified, and Ethan was furious that she even had to be here. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, took her seat. "This hearing will determine custody of Lily Carter," she said. "Both parties will present their case." Mark's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, my client had a long-term relationship with the child's mother. He was a father figure to Lily for years before they were separated. It is in the child's best interest to be with someone who knew her mother." Ethan didn't move, his expression cold. Then James stood. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client is Lily Carter's biological father. The DNA results confirm this. Mr. Reynolds has no legal connection to Lily, and no proof that Rachel Carter wanted him involved in her daughter's life." The judge turned to Lily. "Lily," she said gently, "would you like to say anything?" Lily stiffened. For a second, Ethan thought she wouldn't say anything. Then, "I don't want to go with him," she said firmly. Mark's smirk faltered. "Lily, sweetheart, don't call me that," she snapped. "You didn't care about me before. You only care now because people are watching." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Ethan couldn't have been prouder. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've reviewed all the evidence," she said finally, "and I see no legal grounds to grant custody to Mr. Reynolds." Ethan exhaled sharply, his hands relaxing for the first time all day. Then the judge turned to him. "Mr. Carter," she said, "Lily is your biological daughter. But custody is about more than biology. It's about what's best for the child. So I have one question for you." Ethan met her gaze head-on. "Are you ready to be her father?" Silence stretched. Then, without hesitation, he said, "I already am." The judge studied him. Then, she nodded. "Then custody is awarded to Mr. Carter," she declared. "This hearing is adjourned." Lily let out a breath, her body sagging with relief. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. "It's over," he murmured. Lily looked up at him, her eyes uncertain. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Ethan's chest tightened. So many people had left her. So many people had failed her. And now, she was afraid that he would too. He crouched down next to her, his voice steady. "It's over," he said again. "And I'm not going anywhere." Lily stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, cautiously, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Ethan froze. Then, carefully, he wrapped his arms around her, too. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter wasn't thinking about business or money or winning. For the first time, he was thinking about something bigger, his daughter, his family, and how he would never let anyone take that from him again. For the first time in Lily's short, chaotic life, she was safe. No more hiding. No more cold streets. No more people who pretended to care only to disappear later. For the first time, she had a home. Adjusting to a new life the first few days after the custody hearing felt surreal. Lily wasn't used to this. Waking up in a warm bed, having meals at a set time, not needing to stay alert every second of the day. She had spent so long surviving that she didn't know what it meant to just exist. At first, she still slept lightly, waking up at the smallest sound, heart pounding. She still stuffed food into her pockets, just in case. She still hesitated before sitting on the couch, her fingers brushing over the fabric, as if waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong. But slowly, things began to change. Ethan noticed it first. One morning, she ate a full breakfast without leaving anything behind. The next day, she fell asleep without flinching at every sound. And on the third day, he caught her laughing softly at Buddy, who was rolling around on the expensive carpet like an idiot. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan Carter had built an empire from nothing. He had turned a struggling real estate firm into a billion-dollar dynasty. He had stood in boardrooms, outmaneuvered some of the most ruthless people in the business world, and won battles that seemed impossible. But fatherhood? That was new territory. He didn't know how to talk to a kid, didn't know what they needed, besides the basics like food, clothes, and a roof over their head. And Lily? She wasn't just any kid. She had been through hell, and she had built walls that wouldn't come down easily. Ethan tried to be patient, but patience had never been his strong suit. One night, after she barely responded to him for the entire day, he finally sighed and said, "Lily, if you need space, that's fine. But I need you to know something." She looked up, cautious. "What?" Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. "You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to. But I'll be here when you're ready." Lily blinked. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. And for Ethan, that was enough. The first real moment a week later, something changed. Ethan had been sitting in his office at home, buried in work, when a soft voice broke the silence. "Can I sit here?" He looked up. Lily stood in the doorway, hugging Buddy to her chest, shifting awkwardly on her feet. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to ask." She hesitated, then stepped inside, settling into the chair across from him. For a long moment, they just sat there. Ethan flipping through contracts, Lily pretending to read one of her books. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "My mom used to talk about you." Ethan's hand froze on the page. He looked up, his chest tightening. "She did." Lily nodded, staring at the book in her lap. "She told me that you were really smart," she said softly. "That you worked a lot. That you used to make her laugh." Ethan swallowed hard. "She never told me about you," he admitted. "If she had, I know," Lily said, cutting him off. "I think she was scared." Ethan leaned forward. "Scared of what?" Lily hesitated. "That you'd leave," she said finally. "That you wouldn't want me." Ethan's heart clenched painfully. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Lily," he said, his voice low but firm, "if I had known about you, I never would have left." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. And for the first time, she didn't look away. A family in the making. As the days passed, things continued to shift. Lily started opening up in small ways, asking Ethan questions about his job, about the places he had traveled, about why he didn't have a dog before Buddy. She started trusting him, bit by bit. One night, Ethan was walking past the living room when he heard soft breathing. He peeked inside and saw Lily, asleep on the couch, Buddy curled up beside her. She looked peaceful, like, for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching her. Then, without thinking, he grabbed the extra blanket from the armrest and carefully draped it over her small frame. She didn't wake up, and for Ethan, that was the best sign yet. The final step. 2 weeks after the custody hearing, Ethan took Lily to his lawyer's office. She frowned at the paperwork in front of her. "What's this?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "It's an official adoption request," he said. "If you sign it, you'll be legally mine. Permanently." Lily's eyes widened. "You mean?" Ethan nodded. "I mean, if you want this, if you want to stay, then I want you to be my daughter. Not just on paper. For real." Lily stared at the papers. Her fingers hovered over the pen, shaking slightly. Then, without hesitation, she picked it up and signed her name. And when she looked up at Ethan, there was a small, genuine smile on her face. One that said she finally believed him. One that said she had a home. One that said she had a father. And Ethan Carter, for the first time in his life, felt like he had won something that actually mattered. Epilogue. A new beginning. Months passed. Seasons changed. Lily grew stronger, happier, more confident. She still had her bad days. Days where the past caught up with her. Days where she struggled to trust that this was real. But every time she started to doubt, Ethan was there. One night, she curled up on the couch with Buddy, watching a movie, when Ethan sat down beside her. She glanced at him. "You know," she said, "you're not that bad at this whole dad thing." Ethan smirked. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me," he teased. Lily rolled her eyes, but she was grinning. And then, without thinking, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Ethan froze for a second, caught off guard. Then, slowly, he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. And in that moment, he knew. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a father. And he wouldn't trade that for anything. Not for all the money in the world. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until now, comment, "I watched until the end," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.